and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm In-jung Cho. President Biden and leaders of South Korea and Japan agreed to strengthen military and economic cooperation while committing to consult promptly with each other in the face of regional challenges and threats. They also issued their strongest joint condemnation of Chinese assertiveness. Are the three countries moving closer to a three-way mutual defense agreement? Today, we discuss the ramifications of the Camp David summit with former high-level officials.
Critically, we've all committed to swiftly consult with each other in response to threats to any one of our countries from whatever source it occurred.
한미일 3국 협력체는 오커스, 쿼드 등과 함께 영내외 평화와 번영을 증진하는 강력한 협력체로 기능하면서 확대 발전해 나갈 것입니다.
粗暴干涉中国内政，蓄意挑拨中国与周边国家关系，严重违背国际关系基本准则，中方表示强烈不满。
In the studio with me, Mr. Richard Lawless, founding principal of NMV Consulting. Mr. Lawless was former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs and also served as Deputy Head of the U.S. delegation to the Beijing Six-Party Talks, which addressed the North Korean nuclear program. Mr. Lawless has also spent 15 years as a clandestine services officer in the Central Intelligence Agency, where he specialized in nuclear proliferation issues. His recently published book, Hunting Nukes, addresses both South Korea and North Korea's nuclear programs. Also joining us, Ms. Mary Beth Long, a member of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. Ms. Long served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Chairman of NATO's High-Level Group on Nuclear Issues. Ms. Long was an operations officer for the Central Intelligence Agency, where she was one of 6 women to be first included in the agency's Clandestine Operations in Dangerous Areas Advanced Weapons Course. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, Ms. Long, the leaders of the U.S., South Korea, and Japan in their joint statement called out on Chinese actions against international rules-based order. Has the focus of the trilateral cooperation now moved from North Korea to China?
I don't think so. I think it's important that the statement was made about China. Clearly, Chinese territorial aggression and lack of responsiveness to international norms and law in the Indo-Pacific region is one of the key concerns. But if you look at the actual written statement, there's an awful lot of meat there on North Korea. Not only North Korean missile development and the increasing testing, its use of a so-called space program to hide its interballistic missile activity, but also its use of cryptocurrency. So what this is adding on the reference to China and becoming more holistic, broadening the aperture, but I don't think it's an exchange one for the other.
Mr. Lawless, it is the first time that the joint statement participated by South Korea has called out specifically China by name. Until now, South Korea called out on Chinese actions, but not China itself. Do you think South Korea is now more closely aligning with the United States and discarding its previous strategic ambiguity on China?
Well, I think picking up on Mary Beth's theme, I think mention of China and the way that it was mentioned was unavoidable. We've just reached an inflection point here where there are things we all agree about, unilaterally, bilaterally, and this was an opportunity for all three countries to make a joint statement and agree publicly on where they find themselves vis-a-vis China. Mm-hmm. So it is not just a North Korea issue, but it was unavoidable in this meeting to not mention China. Mm-hmm. Do I believe that it creates a new relationship vis-a-vis as you say, a lack of ambiguity related to South Korea, Republic of Korea, and China? Perhaps, but that's been the de facto situation for some time now. And I think South Korea and the Yoon administration has done a great job in embracing reality and saying there's only so much we can do to kowtow to China. China continues to push. You don't get any traction with China by compromising, and it's time to simply make a statement that we're taking a stance vis-a-vis China, and I think South Korea will be better for it.
So South Korea not kowtowing to China, how would that impact South Korea's diplomacy with China?
I think it makes it more difficult in the short term, but I think it makes it much better in the long term. By better, I mean it places the Republic of Korea in a much stronger position in dealing bilaterally with China. Because what we have here is a South Korea that is obviously more confident, better poised, better positioned in this three-way relationship, whatever we want to call it, to deal with China. Remember, by having the previous relationship that the Moon administration had and its predecessors, where you attempted to accommodate China, you were always putting yourself in the position of trying to find ways to make the Chinese happy. Whether it was on the THAAD deployment, whether it was on any other aspect of the relationship, the Republic of Korea was in an inferior negotiating position. I think this in the longer term, and I give President Yoon full credit for this, has put Republic of Korea on a much higher plane to deal with China effectively.
Mr. Lawless, you say South Korea's diplomacy with China would be difficult in the short term, but even in that short term,
Yes.
China has lifted its group travel ban on South Korea at a time when Yoon administration is closely aligning with Japan and the US. So even in the short term, wouldn't South Korea have more leverage against China if it has closer alignment with US and Japan?
Of course. And we also must take a close look at what's going on internal to China. It's been mentioned that China is about to enter a semi-crisis period. Perhaps it's already there with regard to its economy, demographically, a lot of other issues. And so China must pick its fight with Republic of Korea, I think, much more carefully. It simply doesn't have the ability to close every Lotte department store in China.
Ms. Long, the internal crisis in China that Mr. Lawless just mentioned about, in order to ease that stress at home, wouldn't China grow more assertive towards its neighbors? What comes next in terms of China dealing with the US, South Korea, and Japan?
I agree with Mr. Lawless in that I think you're going to see an attempt to balance across the board, not only China, but South Korea and Japan. I think China hasn't given up on wooing its regional players with positive endeavors like lifting, as you just talked about, but also in pursuing aggressive behavior. Look, China's got a big internal problem, as you mentioned. Economically, the engines and the system that has gotten it to a very wealthy global player are not going to carry them forward. Is there a concern that in order to rally or gloss over domestic problems, that China will create international crisis or a foreign crisis? I think that's possible. I certainly think that looking forward, I don't see the Chinese backing off its aggressive behavior internationally at all. And I think he's got to be concerned how the Chinese military will respond should he invade Taiwan or should he really escalate. And particularly now that there's been these tremendous efforts regionally, not only with the trilateral, but with other exchanges of information where everyone's on high alert. So I think you'll see a balancing, you'll see both.
So I just want to get right to the point. Is China a threat to South Korea? Any one of you?
Sure. In a sense, China's always been a threat. And China has always tried to put the Republic of Korea in its place, even when diplomatic relations were restored between the two countries. It was certainly the Chinese treated the Republic of Korea as an inferior entity. And I think probably the biggest way that China remains a threat is the fact that it has failed dramatically to contain North Korea. And it has failed to contain the North Korean nuclear weapons program. its other strategic weapons program. So in a sense, China has allowed North Korea to not only threaten South Korea, but the stability of all of Northeast Asia. And so you ask, is China a threat to Korea? It is an economic threat, because obviously the largest trading partner that South Korea has, Republic of Korea has, is China. And so there's a lot of ways they can tweak or cause problems for South Korea economically. But the question is now, as we're discussing here today, is China today in a position to use those tools against South Korea economically, politically, as it has done in the past? And I believe they're less inclined and less able to do so. So they're a threat, but I see their main threat being this total failure, now and in the future, to do anything to contain their military alliance partner, North Korea, vis-a-vis South Korea in the region.
Now, Mr. Lawless, some Koreans say it is too risky for South Korea to intervene in the Taiwan issue to the level of how US and Japan intervenes, while others in South Korea say that Chinese invasion of Taiwan is a serious security threat to South Korea as well. So the Taiwan Strait falling under the Chinese influence, is that a threat to South Korea?
I don't know that it's a direct threat to South Korea, and there's always been a lot of confusion about this issue. When Mary Beth and I were in the Pentagon, of course we had to deal with a very progressive South Korean government, unfortunately. But at that time there was a broad misunderstanding about what the relationship would be between the United States basing in the Republic of Korea, and a Taiwan crisis, what we called a Taiwan contingency. So I think this structure that we've come up with at this Camp David agreement does not commit the Republic of Korea to be involved in a Taiwan scenario. It commits them to consult with us. What does that mean to me? It means that if there is a conflict in the Taiwan Straits, certainly Japan would become involved. And the way that consulting works is we reach an agreement beforehand, contingency-wise, as to what the Republic of Korea can do, will do, and perhaps what it's not willing to do. So I think that there is a nuance here that's important related to Taiwan, and I think it's something that can now be discussed under this consultative arrangement among the three parties. We couldn't do that before because we didn't have the forum or the mechanism to consult beforehand. So I think we've taken a step forward here. We probably need to be talking together about Taiwan and what each party is willing to do. But so I think it's a step forward. I don't necessarily think it places the Republic of Korea in a more exposed or dangerous position.
But the Taiwan Strait, if that is blocked, the lifeline to South Korea and Japan is blocked as well. So this is a direct influence to the South Korean situation too.
Oh no, the South Koreans have always paid close attention to our attempts, successful, to keep the Strait of Taiwan open. They understand the importance of that body of water. They understand what the net result for the Republic of Korea would be if China succeeded in suborning or occupying Taiwan. And so that's the type of thing now that we are in a position to discuss among the three parties, which we could have never done before. So I regard this as a major achievement by the national security teams of each of the three countries to recognize that we had to create a mechanism to be able to discuss such contingencies. So I think it's a huge step forward.
So Ms. Long, the commitment to consult, the three leaders agreed at the Camp David that Mr. Lawless has just mentioned. Some people compare this to Article 4 of NATO, and that's why they say now the three countries are like de facto alliance. Now, South Korea-Japan ties used to be the weak link out of the three countries. Do you think now South Korea and Japan are at a place where they could forge de facto alliance?
That's a possibility, and I have to join Mr. Lawless in saying I think what these three leaders have done, particularly the Prime Minister in Japan and President Yoon of South Korea, is courageous. And it is definitely a first step towards a defense alliance of sorts. I worry a little bit about the comparison to Article 4. in many ways, Article 4 is not where you want this trilateral to go. Article 4 is bound by the consensus that is required in NATO. And what it really, and in all of history, it's only been invoked 7 times, 5, I think, by Turkey. So it's not a free-flowing consultative dialogue. It's more of an emergency. I'm putting you on notice. I'm on the path to Article 5, in which there is an agreement, as we all know, that attack against one NATO country, the rest of NATO rises to the defense. There's a lot of constraints and a lot of factors involved in that kind of commitment. The great thing about the trilateral is, number one, it has these consultations happening every year at the presidential, prime minister, or level, at the highest level. That doesn't happen at NATO necessarily. Number two, there's a agreement and an obligation to consult and discuss, but there's also a very clear reflection that this is not an obligation. This is not a consensus-driven organization. You don't have to agree. It's almost an invitation to air discord, ideas, disagreements, particularly when it comes to the national security issues that are embodied in everything that we're speaking about. So in some respects, it's the good parts of Article 4, but without the cumbersome clunkiness of a consensus organization.
Right. Ms. Long, as a high-level former Pentagon official, you just mentioned me about the constraints of Article 4, but the nature of the NATO alliance, wouldn't that be something U.S. wants to forge with South Korea and Japan? Going beyond Article 4, but forming some kind of a military alliance with South Korea and Japan. Isn't that why South Korea and Japan are also participating in all those NATO summits? Wouldn't the United States want to have that kind of alliance relationship in Northeast Asia as well?
I absolutely think that it's critically important to the region as well as to the United States that we have regional agreements and alliances from a defensive standpoint, absolutely, and even beyond that. But taking the NATO structure, the NATO was locked in time, and it reflects the nations and the values and the goals of that period of time. And it's also something very Western. The important thing is to have such a relationship with the regional players that reflect their concerns, very different than European concerns, very different terrain, very different concerns about conflict, very different status of where their militaries are and how they can operate together.
The structure that we have is not an alliance structure, and I'm not sure we need a pure alliance structure in this situation. What we need is an overriding consensus among the 3 countries that we're going to consult on individual issues particularly. For example, there are things we can do today and tomorrow that we don't need an alliance for, a formal alliance. We should be linked in a totally battle-managed situation with ballistic missile defense. That's something that the 3 countries could agree on under the current relationship, put in place, operationalize it, and have work. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to have a joint maritime strategy vis-a-vis a Taiwan contingency. So what we would have here is a situation where we can take individual points of very specific, important levels of cooperation. And if you think the North Koreans or the Chinese are not going to look at this, for example, trilateral ballistic missile defense, it's a big deal.
Yep.
So I think this is something we can accomplish under this particular scheme that we have. So it's really important to move out appropriately, find those individual tactical areas of cooperation, get them in place quickly, and in that sense, again, I don't think we need a formal alliance to do that, because there are things, like you just mentioned, that we probably couldn't agree on.
Mr. Lawless, what the 3 leaders didn't discuss was the nuclear consultative group. And there were expectations that this could expand to include Japan. The fact that the 3 countries didn't officially, publicly discuss nuclear consultative group this time around, does that somehow show that Japan feels burdensome to join in that group?
I think it was a bridge too far. I think we have always been in a situation with the Republic of Korea where that dialogue on a nuclear consultative arrangement was needed, and the Republic of Korea has always wanted that to be hard and firm and in place, a la the NATO nuclear planning group. That was an aspiration, certainly when I was in the Pentagon from 2000 forward, and it rings true today. I'm not sure the Japanese politically are in the same place that the Republic of Korea is. That said, that doesn't mean as we advance our nuclear consultative group or our nuclear sharing group with the Republic of Korea, there won't be a parallel dialogue going on with Japan. Japan is considering right now counterstrike. They're having trouble defining what counterstrike is, whether it's preemptive or whatever it means vis-a-vis North Korea or China. Similarly, Republic of Korea has its own counterstrike internal dialogue going on. So I think the nuclear consultations perforce with the Republic of Korea are going to take place at a different tempo and on a parallel track with any discussions with Japan.
Mr. Lawless, South Korea's opposition politicians criticize that South Korea's security has been jeopardized by China and Russia strongly opposing the new South Korea, Japan, and U.S. enhanced cooperation. What is your reaction to those criticisms from South Korea?
Well, I think first of all, the opposition in Republic of Korea is a little bit wrong-footed. By that, I mean they can't decide whether President Yoon has gone too far or not far enough. So it depends on which newspaper you read which day. But I think it's a bogus or unfair criticism of President Yoon. I think he's been, as you use the term, courageous.
Yeah.
I think he and Kishida both have been very courageous. And I don't think that it puts the Republic of Korea in a more dangerous position. What would one expect China to say looking at this agreement? Of course they're going to be upset. The Russians are going to be upset. The North Koreans are probably complaining to both of them that this has created an anti-North Korean alliance. But I would not expect, actually I thought the Chinese reaction was somewhat restrained.
I agree.
I mean, they could have gone absolutely crazy. So I think that they didn't close any department stores, as you say. They opened the visa line and for South Korea. Maybe we haven't heard the last from China, but Xi Jinping, again, for the reasons we identified, has to be very careful here because he's overplayed his hand, whether it's with the Philippines, with Taiwan, this case with the Republic of Korea. And how many times can you overplay your hand and not be criticized internally? So I reject the idea of the opposition politicians in the Republic of Korea criticizing President Yoon and his decision and his national security team, which, by the way, is superb in the Republic of Korea. I haven't seen talent like this come together for 20 years.
Ms. Long, when you say I agree that Chinese has restrained, could you elaborate?
Yes, the foreign minister complained bitterly, but as far as I'm aware, it wasn't Xi Jinping, it wasn't his national security advisor, it wasn't the military. There are all different kinds of signals that can show the level and the nature of the complaint. This was an official diplomat of the highest rank, and he was upset, but that's sort of normal. I haven't seen any action. Now, it could be that something comes along, but I was somewhat surprised, and happily so, that there didn't seem to be much more of almost an instinctive flail, which also I think makes us all feel better that China's being more thoughtful, perhaps than we had feared.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ms. Long, Mr. Lawless, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.